Hi folks, I'm Alan Watt and this is Cutting Through the Matrix on the 18th of March 2018. I hope everything's going okay for most of you out there. I'm sure it's not actually. We all have our ups and downs. No one is excused of that. And in these days too, things seem to get more and more complicated as the whole system goes through its next unfolding, you might say, dropping away the old stages of the rocket and bringing in the new one. And we're all being trained constantly to update ourselves and update the equipment you work with and everything else. It's quite interesting to stand back and just look at it all. And sometimes it's pretty shocking as well. The main thing today is that I was thinking during the week, I do that once in a while, I was thinking that just looking at all the stuff that's called news today, which really is bizarre. Come on, it's bizarre. Again, if you are getting fed this stuff through television, it's very interesting that, and I know this too from all the countless studies I've done over my entire lifetime and probably before I was born, that through updates from radio, television, and etc., and now it's the internet as well, they can really, really alter all of society and guide all of it along certain paths. That's how things really work, for those who haven't figured it out yet. And really it's an incredible, efficient tool, especially the television. It's had so much acclaim from the top globalists, basically, over the years, and the United Nations too, as they put forward different parts of their agendas on how to train the next crop of youngsters to grow up into the planned society of the future. And it really is incredible in how precise it's put forth and implemented. And people don't even realize they're being brainwashed all the time. That's what it is. After all, if you were living in a true, honest, open society, you would have all knowledge of any particular topic. It wouldn't just be spun knowledge and selected knowledge and so on. It would be all of it available to you for you to choose and make your own mind up. But the last thing they want at the top in any country is for you to make your own mind up. And they're rather arrogant about it today. They're nasty about it, in fact, when you say something that's not quite politically correct, and it's going to get an awful lot worse. I used to study the old Soviet system because it was fascinating to realize, you had this big chunk of the world in the Soviet bloc countries that were copying something or following something called communism and Marxism and so on, and it affected so many millions of people. It caused the deaths of millions of people too. But it really was the epitome of how sides can be created. That's what I really learned, and made to go at each other so much and for so long as well, a whole generation, through the Cold War after the Second World War. And people think, well, that was all over, and we're now back to the old system of what would you call it, free markets or capitalism, which was never free, of course, any more than you're free. And that's the truth of it too. And I remember too them talking about, oh, don't worry. And it was Gorbachev said it when he was still the head of the Soviet Union. He says, don't think that communism is dead. He says you're going to hear about it being dead, but it's not. He said we're moving into the next phase of it, global, basically. And he knew what he was talking about because the real communists were all outside of the Soviet Union. And they've been training a whole generation, even through Oxford and Eton in England, and the same in the States as well, in the top universities. A whole generation was reared in what they then changed the term into, well, either Marxism, they've still copied that or used that, but they also used the term Trotskyism. It sounded more gentler, even though Trotsky was a fiend himself. But reality has got nothing to do with belief systems, and you find that these characters were really lauded in universities. And it's interesting to get the take on it from people like Peter Hitchens, the brother of Christopher Hitchens. Everybody knows Christopher Hitchens because he was so well publicized for the far left. But his brother, Peter, also came out of university in England as a Trotskyist as well. Ready for revolution, he said to himself, like physical revolution. And even when I was growing up, I used to wonder why on earth the countries why would they? It didn't make sense to me If you had to defend your country or your system like they did during World War II, supposedly, even though it was a bit of a fraud too, at least what's happened afterwards, after the wars, but the thing is, defend their culture and their system and all the rest of it. Why would you allow all that time before World War II, through World War II and after it, why would you allow a system that had already proven where it's supposed to go by eliminating supposedly the powerful and the upper crust and most of the middle class as well? That was a big boast of Lenin and Trotsky as well. We'd wiped out a whole middle class. He says, but that was to happen across the whole of Europe. Why would you allow them to come into your universities and teach this as professors? It didn't make any sense, because it wasn't democratic. It was their way or no way. And the Soviet system shows you that too, with the bottomless pits that they kept opening up at the beginning to bury all the people that were slaughtered. And it's no exaggeration. You have the Katyn incidents and other ones as well across the whole Soviet system. Bulgaria had it too. Tremendous documentaries of the sadness of survivors who went through that whole period and watched their friends die and their members of the families die, and often they were almost dead themselves. It was not what you call a democratic live and let live system. And yet here it is being taught for years in universities. Now, let's get it straight. The Soviet system, the communist system, and the Soviet system wouldn't have them take it off at all, would never have happened without the financing and the training of people in especially the States who flooded over, and it's well documented where they came from, who trained them, and they went over as an army basically into the Soviet system to create the Soviet system or the Bolshevik system. Well financed that you wouldn't believe. And even after it was up and running as the communist system, the aid systems from the West, feeding it, clothing it, and so on, right up into World War II and through World War II, it's phenomenal. It would never have survived. And even towards the end, it was had to import most of its grain. Canada and the US were always competing for the bids to get their grain contracts, massive contracts, right up until the very end of it. So which again makes you wonder, why would you feed people who supposedly were ready to blow you out of this, of existence, and you're ready to blow them as well? And it's only then you catch on that there's different realities on the go at the same time. Why would elite, as I say, ever have possibly risked getting slaughtered? Oh, you come into our country, have all your mass meetings in our country and teach our students to be radical and overthrow everything. Why would you allow that to happen? We make all these jokes about the people who are inbred elitists in the UK and elsewhere. And in a lot of countries it's very true. A lot of countries actually. But they're not stupid. And it's certainly, power always hires the best minds, the intellectual minds, to manage their affairs for them. When they hire people for security and keep them up on the world and events and so on, to keep them safe, they're not stupid. So therefore, they were allowed to bring all these people in, knowing it would only go so far. And then you go into all the other writings, too, of Lord Alfred Milner, and who helped, well, actually his group were really responsible for pushing and consolidating what they called the British Empire into their big mandate and agenda. And he used, I think it was Lionel Curtis and other ones too, in the All Souls College, that's where they recruited a lot of them in England, for their kindergarten team, where he sent them across the world to manage the affairs. And they were given appointments to rule countries, even in Africa, within Africa and places like that, in India. And they talked about creating world wars to amalgamate the whole country into their own global system. Tire the people out. You can bankrupt the people too with endless wars, and you could then come in with your big plan for a world governmental system. They passed basically the whole agenda onto the US eventually, because Britain was bankrupt with all these wars. When only a small elite, really, including the Milners and all the rest, who became the Royal Institute for International Affairs, they became awfully wealthy, this private group. And they created the Council on Foreign Relations in the States, and they ran it then from then on. It's still the same today. The headquarters really might be based in London, but most of the work and planning is done through institutions inside this Council on Foreign Relations inside the US and Canada. And they keep changing their names a little bit here and there when the public get to know more and more about them. They change their names. But it's the same group, and they also have many members working as politicians inside the European Union. So they have the EU, Council on Foreign Relations, or Royal Institute for International Affairs, without the royal part in it. The European Institute for International Affairs, it's all the same group, and it has ones for the Far East as well. A big long-term plan agenda. As I say, now why would they use the communist techniques, including everything at United Nations, by the way? And this group set up the United Nations, for those who don't know it. They set up the World Bank, and they run it, this private group, and these banks are private. And they set up the IMF, all private, and the WTO, private. This little world court there, this Star Chamber court, who decides who can trade and who can't, etc. Very secretive. And we take this as normal because we're taught it's normal, that we're dominated by these secret organizations and societies. It's very much like the Freemasons. So the Freemasons says we're not a secret society, we're a society with secrets. Well, it's the same thing with the Royal Institute for International Affairs. In fact, you'll find in the writings of Lord Cecil Rhodes, who founded his group, the Rhodes Foundation, eventually came out of it. But his own group too, they helped take over South Africa and created Rhodesia, and took the gold mines and the diamond mines and so on, along with the different companies that were already there. Rhodes himself said we have to form the society using the Jesuit techniques. And if you understand what they are, it was the same techniques the Illuminati took from the Jesuit training as well. Because the Jesuit order, you have to have a kind of mentor, an older person who's in the order. You're initiated into it. You give your secrets up and your doubts and your fears to your mentor, basically. And in the Jesuit order, the point of it is not for blackmail. The point of it is that you become a better person when you're helped through all the problems that you actually have by confessing. With the Illuminati order, which they created, Weishaupt created, or basically supposedly created, I'm sure it was on the go before it, they copied that technique, but in order to blackmail and push their operatives. And that's the same today, up to the Skull and Bones. You do the same kind of thing, that you give all your data out to a confidant, and of course they have that on record from then on. And they use it against you. So it's not to help you along that way, although it will appear that way, the way they put it across to a candidate. And often the candidate won't really figure it out till much, much later. In fact, to say is so that you can, if you went off and are threatened to go off and do your own thing, or even expose anything, you'd be blackmailed and ruined. So anyway, that's what they mean when that's what Cecil Rhodes meant too when he talked about the copied on the Jesuit technique of confession, etc. And they would mentor their candidates, and they'd really feel they really belonged, really belonged. A lot more to it, of course, than just this brief little thing here. But the thing is, Cecil Rhodes did talk about the global empire, how it would take the world over, basically, and that they themselves, those who created this system, this globalist system, should have the right to manage the world and all the wealth of the world and all of the resources of the world and also the politics of the world. They'd manage all of it, a natural elite. When you really look at the communist system, it isn't much different from that. Under the rhetoric of the people's this and the people's that, with a class system you saw in the Soviet system, and they definitely had an incredible class system from the very get-go. Using science, supposedly, here's the key, using science, or the cover of science, they could then say why they had this division of labour and why you should be down at the bottom digging up the fields there with your little spade, and why they could separate men and women and even put them all to work. They could double the workforce. That's why they also brought women into the workforce in Europe and in Britain, was to double the workforce and to double the taxation and everything else too. Not to free folk up. How does work free you? Think about it. The Soviet system had an incredible class system, and pretty well every ex-spy who defected to the West, who wrote anything about it at all, and even the ones who had little articles in the newspapers about them, they all said the same thing. They didn't defect from the Soviet system because of the Soviet system so much. Because, not for a wealth reason, they had a comparative status as civil servants, high civil servants, or bureaucrats, as the West did, living with the same level of luxury and income. with no lack of the same goods, access to the same goods that everybody in the West at that level would have too. It was for different reasons they would defect. It wasn't for material reasons at all. Whereas the people at the bottom in the Soviet Union all had the same standardized everything pretty well. Really amazing. There's quite a few good documentaries come out of there since. Here's the key to everything. Going back to, for instance, the old British Empire system, Lord Alfred Milner group. They had different names, by the way, initially. And even Winston Churchill knew there was something going on when he was in Parliament. It took him a while to realise who was behind it all. It was so secretive. Didn't even have to catch a name for a while, you see. I've got some of their books here, because they did have world meetings under different guises. And it isn't until you look at who financed the meetings and paid for it, most of it, and who published the books of the minutes of the meetings. It was always the Rockefeller Foundation who did it, and the Rockefeller brothers. Quite amazing, really, even from the early days in the 20s and 30s. So anyway, you get the clues there, and they plan the future and plan the world. And they loved to look at the communist system first. They studied it intensely. They called it the second great experiment, the first being the United States. Could people in the US be allowed to be free? Could they handle freedom? Because freedom would take personal responsibility. That was the big experiment of the US. If not, they would be taken over quietly by basically a society originating from the founders. They would watch it for a few generations and then take it over if they found, or they claimed that they found, that the people couldn't manage freedom. The same thing as the British system, remember. And the guys who came in eventually, right up into Woodrow Wilson's day and so on, and they were all members of this group. In fact, Woodrow Wilson's contact for the group, his main contact was Lord Grey. And getting back to what we're talking about here is the experiment could either succeed or fail. What do you think happened? But what you'll find too, the Milner group that watched all of this and became the Raunch for International Affairs - Council for Foreign Relations, also looked at the Nazi system for a while. Remember, Hitler was Time Man of the Year, twice, in the 30s. Because they were fascinated by order in society. Order. You had the Soviet order system, and you had the German Nazi socialist system. Both socialists, by the way. One was international socialist, supposedly, although the Soviet Union was really, and the Russian system was really ultranationalist. And you had the German nationalist system. And many reasons in fact, Hitler would never come in if it hadn't been for the massive punishment after World War I. And he would never have got the people to back him up either if it wasn't for what happened by those who took over the entire industry of money and entertainment until they literally, and we saw this in Sin Cities, for instance, put out by the CBC Canada. Very good documentary series on the Sin Cities of the 20s and 30s. And they had Paris and Berlin and Shanghai. This is where you always get to with the so-called liberated system when you're going down the tubes financially, but you're free sexually, and they push that instead of money and so on. And through massive depressions in the 20s, etc., they had all these folk rushing into the cities to try to get food or work, and lots of them, male and female, became prostitutes and so on, all kinds too. It's an incredible documentary to do with technique of control. Anyway, it was bringing the countries down so low, and the cultures, and of course you have VD and abortions and all the rest of it skyrocketing, that eventually, and drugs too, they always go together. Therefore, people will want some kind of order to come back in, and so they get a strong man in, and that's what happens. Happens every time. Plato talked about it to an extent too. What happens after this big socialistic system leads to communism, leads to totalitarianism, and then rebellion against it, and so on and so on. It's a constant cycle. And those who rule the world, and we are ruled in the world, they know all this stuff. They bring in all the top professors in their different fields to discuss these things at lots and lots of meetings before you were born, through your life, and then after you're dead. They'll still be doing the same kind of thing. That's how the world is planned and how it's ruled. But as I say, I was thinking about all this just through the week, as your mind just flutters away in between all the different crises that you get hit with. And I looked through the media and I thought, if folk could understand what's really going on, even what they're seeing in the media, it might make a big difference for them personally, for you, not for the mass people. I really don't believe that you can compete with the agencies that also control all your education and indoctrination for every generation. So with thousands of people working at the high levels, designing their toolkits for teachers on different things, how to implement this and implement that, how to turn Johnny into whatever, and you can't compete with that. Of course you can't. And you can't compete with the entertainment industry too, which tucks everything, this PC updated, into movies and made for TV this and TV that. It's all over the place. You see, people can't sit back. I can study anything as I'm watching it, even through an entertainment. I'm still studying it, and I'm aware what's slipped in. And it's astonishing when you're aware to see how much is slipped in per movie, for instance. But I don't have television, so I don't get my daily updating on what's permissible, what isn't permissible, because they're always changing it, of course. You're not allowed to really criticize certain things that were taboo not so long ago. And again, it's interesting. I used to think about this too, and I gave talks on it many, many years ago on ancient religions and things that are poo-pooed by those who believe they're enlightened under the guise of science again, like the communists who say, well, science and secular humanism should rule the world, and then they go and tell you why they should rule you, you see. Why they should, not you should rule you, but they should rule you. That's how it works. But I was thinking about all of that, and it's fascinating, as I say, to watch it working on so many people. It's a rather sad too. I remember I was on a show in the 90s, and at the time, I think it was, some movies give me other ideas from the ones that are intended to push on you, which is mainly, you're fighting something, and they always give you the cause to fight against, which is often the wrong cause too, by the way. And they also tell you who's the good guys and who's the bad people. And they'll put out the words of the bad people, all the things of whichever group they're going to demonize, and they want you to demonize. It's so repetitive, it's just astonishing. But a long time ago in the 90s, there was a prophecy movies, and there's one or two or three of them. They had that actor, Christopher Walken. In the third movie, I think it was, you have this Lucifer character, who assembles himself again, who'd been, I don't know, it's a limbo state, I don't know what it is, for a long time, and somehow they got back together. But he was on top of like a mountain or a pyramid of bodies. And what went through my mind then is how many generations, countless generations, have been born, who've lived, often in hell of a conditions, squalid conditions, poverty galore, across the planet, including the so-called first world countries, by the way. The recent prosperity is more through borrowing, I think, and having credit cards than actual financial reward for working, I think, to be honest with you. I really do think that. Anyway, it was how many generations have lived in and been sent off to wars and fight for things, get slaughtered by the millions for systems that lied to them. I mean, if you went back into the past, for instance, today, in Britain, or France, or even Germany, in all these countries, and if you could possibly go back and prove to the people before war, previous wars, what would happen to them eventually, do you think they'd have gone off and fought at all? Do you really think they would have? If you could show to them, they'd give it another generation after it all, and their children or grandchildren would give it all away, and wouldn't even notice it disappearing. You understand what I'm saying here? You're not fighting for the reasons you're told you're fighting. And often they're very, very different from what you're told. And the outcome always is. But certain people are benefited from it, and do benefit from it, and mightily so for that matter. But you see this big culling of populations. And I've studied this too from different university studies they've done over years. We actually go through the effects of wartime on the domestic populations, the ones who are not over there, whoever there is fighting. And they have all these studies on crime dropping, for instance. When it's a real cause, and people are taught that they're fighting for their very, very existence. And they give up all their rights to be under this totalitarian rule, as they did in Britain And as the member of the Green Party said quite a few years back, a woman, I don't know who she was, but she was a leader at the time, she said it'd be so great if we could bring it back to the Blitz and get people to obey authority and do what they're told, and they wouldn't even grumble about it, they would just get on with it and live in austerity. If you could just recreate those same conditions. Because she was, see, they know all this stuff at the top. And they can bring in poverty and obedience. And they don't have all these other problems breaking out at that time. The studies and all the different crimes studies and different types of crime were drastically reduced during times of war. Isn't that quite amazing how we're studied like that too? Meanwhile, all the folk who are doing the fighting and dying haven't a clue that they're being studied like that back home for other reasons, or even for the post-war reasons too, which they don't even think of if you're in the front lines. You don't know if you're going to have a post-war for yourself. That's how bad it is, really. With intensive study for all these special groups that study us minutely, like some little bug, like an ant in the anthill, basically. But as I say, in the prophecy, I saw that's the idea that came into mind. Countless generations born, layers and layers upon them, born, lived, but their entire life long, none of them had a clue, very few would have a clue, of what really was going on. Really. They would believe they did. That's true. They would believe they knew what was going on, because they were told by people in positions of authority. And they would believe it. Why not? Because you can't live paranoid your whole life. You're not born paranoid. And you do, or they used to expect your parents, for instance, your immediate relatives and so on, to warn you of things like any other mammal. They warn their offspring what's dangerous to them. But we have an entirely different system today, where authorities bypassed parental input or even local elder input until those at the top are managing us so well indeed. Bertrand Russell said it. He was one of the biggest players in this, along with the Macy Group, Frankfurt School, and so they all worked together to create a culture post-World War, right through into the 21st century. A lot of what you're living through today, step by step, was planned minutely, actually, by these groups and these people, like Bertrand Russell. And they were given all this incredible backing and financing, and they were given a stage to exposit their stuff upon the world. And they got it. But they're quite open about where they were taking it all. How it would change all the mores and morals of sexuality. How they used to, as Russell said, we used to think we'd have to take the children from the parents. And the state would rear them, because the parents would be contaminated with old-fashioned ideas, meaning normal ideas. And the state would bring them up instead and give all their values to them. But then they realized that if they got the children young enough, they could still leave the financial rearing of the children, just the cost of paying for having the child and the cost of that child to the parents. But the state could still give them their indoctrination, and that's exactly what they've done. It's amazing to read this stuff and live through an era when you watch it all happening, all this stuff. It's quite fascinating. When most folk around you will think that life is somehow stumbling along and evolving all by itself. It's really fascinating. It fascinates me. Most folk might not care. Other folk are doing pretty well financially, and they don't care either what's happening to other people or where it's all going. Why they don't feel any indignation at all. And the reason that we allow the horror to come along every so often is because people just give up being indignant about things. That's why it happens. The old saying that the reason that evil triumphs is because good men and women will do nothing, basically. But it's very, very true. Most folk today are so mind-bombed with distractions and entertainments of all kinds that you could never, ever have imagined 40, 50 years ago. It was heavy enough then, but it's a lot worse now. It's so easy to shape everything. Now, getting back to what I was saying about how we live today, how we've been shaped to live today. And we have been shaped. Everything that happens is shaped that way, by the way. There's articles I've got from the 80s and 90s studies by different departments, including defense departments, of futuristic looks at the world if they started wars across the Middle East or Africa, and how would they cope with mass immigration? Could they even help immigration flood into all this stuff that's happening today was talked about, and all the contingency plans and how to even make it happen way back in the 70s and 80s. In the 70s, I can remember the Rockefellers prattling on about the same kind of thing. The techniques would arrive, Brzezinski said it too, of communication that would revolutionize society. And they're talking about the internet and so on. But also they mentioned that there'd be mass movements of peoples across the whole world, of mass migrations. And you think it's all happening just because of the wars you're having, etc. You have no idea of how much work goes in, and teaching goes in, and directing immigrants and migrants of how to do things, where they have to go, etc., by thousands of agencies across the planet, all working down below like a pyramid at the top, a pyramid head at the top, I should say. That's how the whole society works. It's all coordinated.
If you want a picture of the future, imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever. The moral to be drawn from this dangerous nightmare situation is a simple one. Don't let it happen. It depends on you.
I find no entertainment in it anymore. Not when you've seen behind the veil. You know, it's all Brennan Circus, smoke and mirrors. It's hard to get into storylines, and because you know it's all bullshit. It's just all bullshit. Everything's bullshit, and you see the symbolism. You pick up on the underlying messages and agendas being pushed, and then it just gets upsetting, and then you get fucking pissed. So I don't expose myself to that shit. Hi-yo.
I don't really know. I mean, as an awake person, when you can't reach out to people, I mean, what are you supposed to do, and how are we supposed to keep our hopes up? I mean, it's so depressing when you think of it.
Yeah, it is, because the conditioning on most people, when you see them and they can't look you in the eye or they think you're crazy, is because the condition has taken perfectly on them. And you're looking at conditioned robots, really. And they'll turn on you too. At the right time, they'll turn on you. But that's the perfect conditioning. The ones who are awake generally have always been awake, or they've known something was wrong. And they can't be conditioned quite the same way. But you're in amongst most people where the conditioning has worked perfectly, and that's the problem. I've always said the elite have a symbiosis amongst the masses of people, the general mass of people, because the masses always look towards government to solve problems, even if it's a fake problem put out by the government. We immediately run to help us, save us, you know. There's only very few people in between, in the middle, who don't want to be stinking rich and rule everyone else's lives for them, and they don't want to belong to the general mob that just goes and watches all the porn on their internet all day long, or ball games or whatever. So it's a small group really who don't belong to either camp. That's a problem, because as I say, the masses have a symbiotic relationship with the elite, and eventually when they get all their agendas through, the elite will turn around and say, we couldn't have done it without you, to the masses.
Yeah, and that's such a... I think it's disgusting. There's no other word for it. It's just utterly disgusting. Yeah?
It is, and it's very depressing until you realize that you might be surprised how many of those in between who are not brainwashed or conditioned and who don't seek personal power can still have a voice and start changing things around. And that's the only hope that we have, is to postpone it at least long enough. They'll either wither away, or they'll come out with an even heavier hand. But that's when even the masses start to see it and they know something's wrong, when the heavy hand of the monster comes upon them. And that's what it might take. Stall them long enough until timetables, according to those at the top, cannot be stalled. If you can stall their timetables, they get awfully angry and they start using force. Force is, at least the use of force, terrifies the public, and maybe even to waking up a little bit. And that's all we can really hope for. It's because it's too perfect. It's been here too long. This system.
But we cannot use violence and force.
No, they're so perfectly good at getting us to kill each other or fight each other. This has been a strategy for centuries, and it's a perfect art of how to get it all going. We can't use that at all. And by the same token, we have to make sure that the elites don't come out with a heavy hand and start using open force on the general public. Here's the thing too. They have been using force, or at least deadly intentions on the general public, because they know how they've been dumbing us down. They know when they rob your mind, this is the same as killing you. And when they inject things into you too that make the autism bloom, and it also makes everyone quite a few points lower in the IQ scale, makes us all sick so that we'll die off early, infertile, etc. They are physically, literally, this is a targeting, this is a murderous rampage has been going on for a long time under the usual covert actions of the United Nations that always deny what they're doing. One of the top players in this, who wrote about it, who taught Rhodes Scholars back in the 40s and 30s, internationalist again, who spoke, by the way, so he made a great speech in Sweden, was Toynbee. There were two Toynbees, father and son, and one took over from the other. But they literally taught the Rhodes Scholars for internationalism and to penetrate all governments and push them towards internationalism. He said, we always deny with our mouths what our hands are doing. And that was to become the mantra for every organization within the United Nations. We always deny with our mouths what our hands are doing. And that's still their strategy today.
Respect the elderly, mother.
I miss my calling.